There are places in the Pacific Northwest where people don't come back the same. Coast Guard stations that record your death before it happens. Logging towns where the trees bleed when you cut them. Fishing villages where the darkness is alive and hungry. Tonight, you'll hear 11 accounts from survivors who discovered what's really waiting in the fog. Some are still trying to escape. Others have accepted they never will. Welcome to Verified Fears. I've been studying atmospheric phenomena for 17 years, and I thought I understood fog. I thought I knew the science behind it, the temperature inversions, the dew point calculations, the maritime pressure systems that create banks of vapor rolling in from the Pacific. I came to Cape Disappointment in November with equipment worth $40,000 and the confidence of someone who'd spent half their career explaining weather to people who didn't care. I left 2 weeks later understanding that fog isn't just a meteorological event. Sometimes it's a warning. Sometimes it's a mechanism. Sometimes it's alive in ways that shouldn't exist outside of nightmare logic. Cape Disappointment sits at the convergence of the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean, a headland in southwestern Washington that's been the site of countless shipwrecks, mysterious disappearances, and strange phenomena documented by maritime services for over a century. The Coast Guard station there is officially staffed, though staffed is generous. There's usually just one meteorologist and 2 maintenance technicians rotating through 6-week assignments. The lighthouse still operates, mostly automated now. But the older buildings remain functional, including the meteorological station where I was supposed to spend 3 weeks conducting a study on unusual fog pattern data that had been flagged by regional weather services. The fog at Cape Disappointment isn't normal fog. Everyone who works there long enough figures this out, though most of them rationalize it through conventional explanations. The maritime layer is particularly dense during certain months, they say. The convergence creates unusual wind shear. The monitoring equipment is sensitive to coastal anomalies. But the records told a different story if you knew where to look. 7 technicians had requested transfers in the last 4 years. 2 had left without completing their assignments. And one, a meteorologist named Dr. James Hendricks, had submitted a final report in 2008 that was marked inconclusive and filed away, never published. I found Hendricks' personal notes in the archive room, tucked behind official reports. He'd documented everything: dates, times, atmospheric readings, observations. The entries grew increasingly erratic, his handwriting deteriorating from precise scientific notation to fragmented phrases. 9:47 p.m. Fog banks concentrated at 60-meter elevation, shapes visible at perimeter, not wind formations, stationary, observing. Then, 2 weeks later, they moved closer last night. Can't measure exact distance. Fog occludes all reliable markers. Shapes approximately 6 feet tall. Humanoid profile. Face indistinguishable. The final entry was dated 14 days after his assignment began. I can see myself standing in the fog. Same clothes, same position. We're facing the shore. Hendricks never submitted another report. He was found in his quarters 3 days later, physically, unharmed but suffering from severe dissociative episodes. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility, and his position was marked as voluntary termination due to health concerns. No follow-up investigation, no attempt to verify his observations with instrumentation. I should have left right then. I should have read those notes, felt the ice in my spine, and requested immediate reassignment. But I was a scientist. Hendricks was clearly experiencing some form of psychological break. Stress-induced hallucinations, isolation psychosis. The assignments were long and the station was remote, and sometimes people's minds played tricks. I was different. I had proper training. I had protocols. I had the comforting certainty of someone who'd never yet encountered something that contradicted the basic laws of physics. The fog started appearing at 9:47 p.m. on my third night. I was running routine atmospheric analysis when one of my instruments flagged an anomalous pressure reading. I checked the sensor, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, all within normal parameters, except for one peculiarity. The fog was denser than the surrounding air should allow. It shouldn't have formed a visible boundary, but there it was on my thermal imaging, a distinct line separating clear air from opaque gray. I went to the observation room and looked out toward the shoreline. The fog was rolling in with mechanical precision, creating a wall that moved neither faster nor slower, neither spreading nor contracting. It simply advanced at a consistent rate, like a curtain being drawn across the landscape. I took photographs, recorded video, documented everything. At 9:51 p.m., I noticed something in the fog that made my chest tighten. Shadows, shapes, figures standing motionless within the murk, their outlines barely visible, their forms indistinct. I called the station's night watch officer, a maintenance tech named Rodriguez. "Are there personnel outside?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "In the fog?" "Negative," he said. "Everyone's inside." "Why?" "I'm seeing shapes in the fog bank. Could be some kind of atmospheric illusion, pareidolia, but I want to confirm personnel status." Rodriguez came up to the observation room. He looked at the fog, at my monitoring equipment, at my face. I saw the realization spread across his features, the recognition of what I was seeing, what it meant, what questions I was about to ask. "Dr. Hendricks saw them too," he said quietly. "Different people saw them at different times, but they always appeared at 9:47 p.m. "What are they?" I asked. "Nobody knows. They never get closer than about 200 yards. They just stand there, facing the shore, not moving. And in the morning, they're gone." I spent the next week documenting the phenomenon with obsessive intensity. Every evening at 9:47 p.m., the fog would appear. Every night, the figures would materialize within it. I captured them on thermal imaging, on visible spectrum photography, on my atmospheric instruments. The readings were impossible. The figures registered as approximately human temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But the fog itself was only 54 degrees. There should have been visible condensation from that thermal differential. There wasn't. The figures didn't cast shadows in conventional ways. They appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. On the 8th day, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was reviewing footage from the previous night when I noticed something in the background of one of my thermal images. A reflection in the darkened window of the observation room. A figure standing behind me. The same figure that was standing in the fog 200 yards away. I rewound the footage, enhanced it, played it back frame by frame. In every single frame where a figure appeared in the fog, that same figure appeared in the window behind me, standing in the observation room. But I'd been alone. I'd checked. The door was locked. Nobody had come in. Yet there it was, a thermal signature of a human-shaped form standing directly behind where I sat, impossibly present and impossible to explain. I began correlating the figure positions with my own location. On November 11th, the figure in the fog was roughly 300 yards away, but the figure in the window reflection was closer, maybe 20 feet. On November 15th, the outdoor figure was closer to 100 yards, and the window reflection figure was only 10 feet away. They were moving simultaneously, closing the distance in parallel. That night, November 15th, I made a decision that still haunts me. I stayed up past 9:47 p.m. I waited for the fog. I watched it roll in with the same mechanical precision, and I watched the figures materialize. I positioned myself directly in front of the observation room window, facing outward, and I looked at the figure in the reflection. I really looked at it. The face was my face. Same features, same age, same expression of confused horror. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected no light. They were empty in a way that suggested not the absence of light, but the absence of consciousness. The figure wearing my face stood in the window reflection, with its body facing the shore, its head tilted slightly, and its non-reflective eyes fixed on something I couldn't perceive. I ran. I'm not proud of it. But I ran downstairs, I got Rodriguez, and I showed him the footage. He watched it without surprise, without shock. He just nodded with the weariness of someone watching another technician learn a truth that the station had been keeping for years. Hendricks figured it out, Rodriguez said. Each person here for more than a week, the fog starts showing them versions of themselves. Copies. They get closer every night. After about 2 weeks, the copy is close enough to come inside. That's when people request transfers or stop reporting to their stations. What happens to them? I asked. The copies. What are they? I don't know. But Hendricks, he stayed after his copy got all the way up to him. He was in his quarters. We found him staring out the window at nothing. He kept saying he wasn't sure which one was real anymore, him or the one in the fog. Whether he was the original, or if he'd already been replaced and nobody noticed. I left Cape Disappointment the next morning. I reported equipment malfunction, falsified sensor data, submitted my resignation, effective immediately. I told no one what I'd actually documented. I wrote up Hendricks' notes and my own data, encrypted the files, and locked them away where they belong. But here's what keeps me awake at night. I've been watching my own reflections, in mirrors, in windows, in any reflective surface. I keep catching glimpses of someone standing behind me who shouldn't be there. Someone with my face and empty eyes. Every reflection is a little clearer than the last. Every image is standing a little closer than it should. I don't know if I left the station in time, or if I brought something back with me. I don't know if the figure in the fog that looked like me stayed there, or if it followed me home. I don't know if I'm the original anymore, or if I've already been replaced and I'm just too deep inside my own delusion to recognize it. Here's what I need to know from you. Have you ever caught something in a reflection that you couldn't explain? Have you ever been absolutely certain that whatever was standing behind you in a mirror wasn't your actual reflection? Because if you have, you need to know that Cape Disappointment isn't unique. That fog isn't just appearing in Washington. The phenomenon has been documented, unofficially, quietly, hidden away in archives that are supposed to stay closed, in coastal stations all up and down the Pacific Northwest. And the figures are getting closer every year. The 9:47 p.m. fog is arriving in more locations. The copies are multiplying. And nobody's talking about it because nobody wants to admit what it means when you see something wearing your face that definitely isn't you. What would you do if you caught your reflection looking back at you with eyes that reflected no light? My name's not important anymore. The cops know who I am. The Forest Service knows. And if you're reading this, you probably don't care about names anyway. You care about what happened that night in November when 6 of us went into the Timber Ridge Forest to make one last score before the season closed. We were desperate. The mill had been shuttered for 37 years since 1987, and the town was dying. Forks, Tacoma, all the logging communities were shrinking, turning into tourist traps or ghost towns. Timber Ridge wasn't even on most maps anymore. Population somewhere between 40 and 60, depending on whether you counted people who'd actually died, but nobody reported it. We'd gotten a tip from someone who knew someone that there was old-growth timber on protected land, about 12 miles northeast of town, in a section that the government had supposedly marked off limits back in the 70s. The trees were massive. Some of them had to be 300 years old. And the paper companies would have paid serious money for that wood if we could get it harvested and moved. 20 grand each if we could pull it off. Maybe 30. It was illegal as hell. But we were broke, our families were broke, and nobody was coming to save Timber Ridge with legitimate work. The plan was simple. We'd go in Wednesday night, do the cutting Thursday and Friday while visibility was low, and haul everything out by Saturday. 6 chainsaws, 6 men, 2 trucks hidden 2 miles away. Tommy, Marcus, Derek, me, and 2 guys from out of town whose names I still don't speak. We went in equipped, professional about it. We weren't amateurs. Most of us had worked mills or done contract logging. We knew what we were doing. The forest up there isn't like normal Pacific Northwest timber stands. It's older, denser. The trees create a canopy so thick that even at midday it looks like dusk. The ground is soft. Moss so deep you sink into it. Ferns as tall as your chest. Everything wet and rotting and alive in this accelerated way that feels wrong. The smell is overpowering. Not fresh like people imagine old-growth forests smell. More like something dying very slowly, decomposing in real time while still standing. We cut a path in and set up our first work zone around 11 p.m. Thursday morning. The trees were monsters. The first one we marked had to be 16 feet in diameter at the base. We started the chainsaws and went to work. The cut was clean, professional. By 2 p.m. we had the first tree down, and we started the bucking process, cutting it into manageable logs. That's when we noticed something wrong. The tree's interior wasn't the pale wood we expected. It was darker, almost bruised looking. And when we cut deeper, it got worse. The wood started getting redder. Actual red, like meat. Probably iron oxide in the soil, Derek said. But he said it wrong. His voice was uncertain. Iron oxide doesn't look like blood. Iron oxide doesn't smell like copper and rust and something organic that makes your stomach flip. We kept cutting. Professionals push through weird stuff. We needed the money. We made the cuts, and we moved on to the second tree. Same thing. Darker interior. Red wood. But this time, when we finished the first clean cut on the trunk, the tree didn't just sit there. It moved. The cut edge actually expanded slightly, like the tree was breathing, like the wound was pulsing. We all saw it. Nobody said anything. We just stared. Marcus ran his hand along the cut. Still wet, he said. Interior moisture, that's all. But it wasn't moisture. It was warm. He jerked his hand back. It's hot. The wood's hot. By 4 p.m. we had 4 trees down, and every one of them had the same characteristics. Red interior, warm to the touch, and they were all healing. The cuts we'd made in the morning were closing. The red wood was knitting back together, creating this twisted, scarred surface where we'd opened them up. It wasn't fast. You could only see it if you looked at something you'd cut hours before. But it was happening. Trees didn't do that. Wood didn't do that. We should have left. Every rational thought screamed at us to pack up and get out. But we'd only gotten 4 trees. We weren't going to leave with nothing. We told ourselves it was some weird adaptation. Maybe the trees were diseased but valuable anyway. Maybe nobody needed to know exactly what we'd encountered. We went back to camp and slept in the trucks, and none of us talked about what we'd seen. Friday morning, we started again. The plan was to finish 6 more trees, get the heavy equipment in to move them, and clear out by evening. We fired up the chainsaws at 7 a.m. The first cut of the day went into a massive tree on the north side of our work zone. The chainsaw screamed into the wood, and the tree screamed back. That's the only way I can describe it. It was a sound, a high-pitched, sustained shriek that came from inside the wood. It wasn't wind through branches. It wasn't creaking timber. It was a scream. Human-level frequency. A sound that made your teeth ache and your spine want to curl up on itself. The chainsaws cut into it deeper, and the scream got louder. All 6 chainsaws started up in response. All 6 of us instinctively hit the kill switches. Silence. Complete silence, except for our breathing and the idle rumble of equipment still running. And then Derek started screaming for real. He was holding his arm, and his arm was wrong. It was split open from wrist to elbow, the cut jagged and deep and bleeding hard. He said the chainsaw jumped. Said it kicked back, but he wasn't the one holding a running chainsaw. His was off. One of the other guy's chainsaws was running, and it was positioned right where Derek's arm had been. We got a tourniquet on him, radioed for emergency services from a portable unit. He needed hospital-level care, and we all knew it. While we were dealing with Derek's arm, Tommy noticed something in the tree we'd been cutting. The wound had changed. Instead of the usual red interior, there were shapes visible in the cross-section, shapes that looked like fingers, fingernails, palm creases. "There's something in there," Tommy said, and his voice was shaking hard. "Inside the tree. There's something in there, and it's human." We looked closer. The cut surface of the tree showed cross-sections of what looked unmistakably like human tissue embedded in the wood. Bones, hair, teeth. Not recent remains. These were ancient, partially fossilized, integrated so completely into the tree's growth structure that they'd been part of the wood for decades, maybe centuries. The tree had grown around them, incorporated them. And when we cut the tree, we'd expose them. The 2 out-of-town guys didn't say anything. They just grabbed their gear and walked out of the forest. Just walked. Didn't run, didn't panic. Just methodically collected their stuff and left. We never saw them again, and the cops never found them. They're just gone. The rest of us got Derek to his truck and drove him to the ER. He lived physically, but he won't talk about that day anymore. He just sits in his house and doesn't leave. Sometimes I see him looking out the window at his own hands, like he doesn't recognize them. Marcus started having nightmares about tree growth. He told his wife that he could feel bark forming on his skin at night, that he'd wake up and his arms were covered in these weird brown growths that would peel off like extreme dandruff. She took him to dermatologists. They found nothing. Then he stopped mentioning it, stopped talking about it entirely. Now he just wears long sleeves year-round, even in summer. I got lucky. My hands didn't do anything. But I've been researching the area, trying to understand what we encountered. The forest we were in wasn't naturally occurring. It was planted. In the 1920s, loggers cut the original timber out of that region, and some of the workers died in an accident, a collapse in an old mining structure they didn't know was there beneath the forest floor. 8 men, gone. The company covered it up. They brought in saplings and replanted the area, tried to restore it. Except the trees didn't grow normally. They grew wrong. They incorporated the remains, the blood, the essence of the men who died there. Timber Ridge Town was founded by families who knew what was in that forest. They made a pact, something that's written down in old ledgers I've found in the Historical Society. They agreed to protect the forest, to keep people out, to treat it as sacred ground where the buried were allowed to rest. Every few decades, someone would get curious, try to cut trees or explore. Something would happen. An accident, an injury, a disappearance. The forest policed itself because the town wouldn't. We broke that pact. We tried to harvest what should never be harvested. And the forest responded the way it was designed to respond, with violence, with injury, with the consumption of trespassers. Here's what I need to ask you. If the land itself is conscious, if it can protect what belongs to it and punish what doesn't, how do you know the forests around your own town are empty? How do you know there isn't something similar happening in the protected areas near where you live, something that the locals know about but have agreed to keep quiet about? And most importantly, if you discovered that your town's history included a covered-up death, would you respect the forest's claim to vengeance? Or would you think you knew better? The first time I noticed something wrong with the salmon was November 14th. I was conducting routine water quality samples at the mouth of the Nehalem River, where it feeds into the bay, about 3 miles downstream from the village of Nehalem, Oregon. The water temperature was dropping as it should for late autumn, and I was monitoring dissolved oxygen levels for a coastal research project. That's when I saw the fish. There were thousands of them. The Nehalem Bay salmon run had always been moderate, nothing like the Columbia River migrations, but this was unprecedented. The water was literally packed with bodies, dead bodies. Every single salmon I could see was floating belly up or drifting with the current in that specific way. That means no life is driving the movement. But they were still swimming. Their tails were moving. Their gills were still working. The entire population of fish was simultaneously dead and mobile, operating on some kind of biological autopilot that shouldn't have been possible. I collected samples. I documented water chemistry. I filmed the phenomenon on my phone because nobody was going to believe what I was seeing. The salmon were moving upriver despite being clearly deceased. Eyes clouded over, bodies decomposed to the point where flesh was separating from the skeleton, yet still driven by some mechanism toward their spawning grounds miles inland. It was like watching a horror film where something had animated corpses and forgotten to make them look alive. By that evening, the local fishing community had noticed. The Nehalem Bay area had maybe 300 permanent residents, most of them connected to fishing or tourism. People were pulling dead salmon out of the water, confused about what was happening, calling the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The official response was equally confused. Algae bloom? Disease? They ran tests. They found nothing unusual in the water chemistry. The salmon were dead. The salmon were also somehow still moving. There was no explanation that fit the parameters. Then people started getting sick. Not dramatically, nothing acute, just subtle things at first. A woman named Catherine, who'd handled several of the fish, reported feeling a compulsion to walk down toward the river around dawn, even though she lived 2 miles away. A fisherman named Dale said he couldn't stop thinking about water, about moving upstream, about reaching somewhere he couldn't remember being before. 3 teenagers who'd been playing near the docks woke up asking why their parents were stopping them from going to the beach, why they had to stay in their rooms, why the only thing they wanted to do was get back to the water. I documented everything. I was supposed to be there for 2 weeks as part of a standard environmental assessment project. The university was interested in how coastal communities were being affected by changing ocean temperatures. I hadn't expected to encounter a phenomenon that violated basic biological principles. By November 18th, I'd set up monitoring equipment at multiple points along the river, and I was essentially functioning as both scientist and reporter, trying to make sense of what was happening. The illness, and I'm going to call it an illness because there was no better term, seemed to progress on a timeline. People who'd had direct contact with the dead salmon started showing symptoms within 36 hours. The compulsion to return to the river was the first sign. Then came the physical changes. Skin texture would alter slightly, becoming smoother, almost scaly. People reported difficulty breathing air, a sensation of drowning that they described as happening while they were standing in rooms with normal atmospheric oxygen. Fingernails began thickening. The whites of eyes took on a faintly iridescent quality. Catherine, who'd been one of the first to get sick, called me on the 19th and asked if I could come to her house. She sounded wrong on the phone. Her voice had this quality that I can only describe as echoing, like she was speaking from inside water. When I arrived, I found her in her bedroom with her window open despite the cold temperature. She was soaking wet, and the carpet around her was destroyed, the padding saturated. She'd been pouring water over herself repeatedly, she explained. She couldn't stop. Every time the wetness dried, the compulsion became unbearable. "I know where I need to go," she told me, her speech slurring slightly. "I can feel it. The river's calling. Not like something external. I can feel it the way I feel my heartbeat. It's part of me now. It knows me. It knows what I need to do." "What do you need to do?" I asked, though I didn't want to know the answer. "Return," she said. "Go back to where I spawned. I need to go back and die properly, the way it's supposed to happen." I got her to a hospital in Tillamook. The doctors found nothing medically wrong. Her blood work was normal. Her tissue samples were normal. But she deteriorated over the next 3 days, becoming increasingly obsessed with returning to the water. Until finally, she simply walked out of the hospital in the middle of the night and headed toward the coast. They found her 3 days later at the mouth of the river, standing in water up to her chest, looking upstream with an expression of perfect peace. She wasn't struggling. She was just standing there, waiting for something. By November 21st, there were 43 documented cases. The CDC got involved. The state health department set up a perimeter around the river. But the infection, because that's what it clearly was, had already spread beyond containment. People who'd eaten salmon at restaurants, people who'd been downstream, people who'd just spent time near the water without direct contact, were all showing early symptoms. I interviewed a teenager named Marcus, who was in the early stages of transformation. He was lucid, terrified, and articulate about what was happening to his body. He described it as his cells receiving new instructions, like someone had rewritten his DNA to suit a different purpose. His muscles ached in ways that suggested they were reorganizing. He could hear things now, frequencies in the water that weren't audible before. And most disturbing, he had memories that weren't his own. Memories of swimming upriver, memories of spawning, memories of dying. "I remember being born in this river," he told me, his eyes wide with the horror of his own words. "Not like I was born here before. I remember my existence starting in gravel at the riverbed. I remember the feel of current. I remember predators hunting us in schools. And I absolutely know, that I'm supposed to go back there and complete the cycle." I traced the infection back to a specific batch of salmon that had been distributed through local restaurants and fish markets. They'd all come from a single processor. When I investigated that facility, I found records going back decades showing periodic, unexplained die-offs of salmon populations in the processing stream. The facility's director, a woman named Helen Russo, who'd been there for 35 years, finally admitted what was happening when I showed her my data. The Nehalem River had been the site of a sacred Native American spawning ground. In the 1920s, a dam had been built downstream, disrupting the salmon migration patterns. The tribe, according to Helen, had placed a curse on the location, not out of malice, but as a way of protecting their ancestral heritage. They'd embedded something. She never specified what, used terms like spiritual programming and biological memory, into the river ecosystem itself. The curse was supposed to prevent fishing, to make the river unsafe for commercial harvesting. Instead, it had evolved. It had learned. The salmon that tried to spawn in the river began carrying something in their flesh, a kind of informational parasite that could be transmitted to humans who consumed them. And that parasite had one purpose. It was trying to complete the cycle. It was trying to turn people back into salmon, or at least into something that resembled the spawning process. The compulsion to return to the river, the physical transformation, the memories of life in water. These were all mechanisms designed to drive infected humans into the river, where they would enter the water, and the water would complete the transformation. Helen showed me research she'd been conducting in secret for 25 years. She'd documented 127 cases of infection going back to 1998. Some of the infected people had simply vanished into the water. Others had managed to stay on land, but they were trapped, unable to fully transform, unable to live normally, existing in this agonized state between human and salmon. A few had relocated far from water and reported that the compulsions faded after several years, though they never fully disappeared. The river's hungry, Helen told me. It's not trying to be malicious. It's trying to restore what was taken from it. And it's learning how to do it better each time. By the time I left Nehalem Bay on November 24th, 147 people had been documented with active symptoms. The government was setting up quarantine zones. They were releasing information about avoiding salmon from the Nehalem River. But the damage was already dispersed. The infection had reached Portland. It had reached Seattle. Salmon from the contaminated processor had been shipped across the entire Pacific Northwest. The question I need to ask you is this. Every salmon season, thousands of people eat fish from rivers where indigenous peoples have embedded spiritual protections for centuries. How many of them have already consumed something that's slowly rewriting their biology? How many people are feeling compulsions they can't explain, sensations of drowning that don't make logical sense, memories of lives they've never lived? And most importantly, what happens when the infection reaches critical mass? When enough people have been transformed that they all simultaneously feel the need to return to water? This is Technician James Werner. Maintenance Rotation 7, Day 4 of 14. Arrived at the station November 3rd via helicopter. Weather conditions stable. All equipment functional except, actually, I need to note this. The seismograph in the main lab is doing something unusual. The needle's been active for 3 days straight, but there's no seismic activity, no tremors, no detected movement. But the needle keeps drawing lines, patterns. I'm going to document this in the maintenance log because it doesn't make sense. Maintenance Report, November 7th, 2025. Equipment status. All systems operational except Seismograph Unit 4, which shows needle activity inconsistent with detected seismic data. James Werner recommends replacement or recalibration. Recommendation: monitor for 48 hours before deciding on replacement. Recovered audio log, Mount St. Helens Station, November 8th, 2025, 09:23. The seismograph is still active. I've been watching it for hours. The needle movements aren't random. They're consistent, rhythmic almost. And I'm going to say this, even though it's going to sound insane. It looks like it's drawing faces, not abstract patterns. Actual faces, different faces each time. I've been taking photographs of the readouts because I know what I'm about to tell the university is going to sound like I'm losing my mind up here. But yesterday, it drew what looked like a family photo. Parents and 3 kids. Today, it drew what looks like a single portrait, very detailed, very specific. I can count the person's teeth in the seismic readout. How is that possible? University response. Email to Werner, November 8, 2025. James, your report is concerning. It's possible the equipment has suffered electrical degradation despite showing normal operational status. We're recommending you photograph the readouts and submit them via satellite uplink. We'll have our lab analyze the images. In the meantime, continue standard maintenance protocols and log any changes. The station is important to our research. Don't let equipment failure compromise data collection. Recovered audio log, Mount St. Helens Station, November 9, 2025, 16 to 11. The seismograph has started making sounds. I don't know how that's even possible. The needle moving shouldn't produce audio, but there's definitely sound coming from the equipment. It's like voices. Distant voices speaking in a language I don't recognize. It started faintly around noon, and now it's loud enough that I can hear it clearly from across the room. I tried turning off the equipment. It kept playing. I unplugged it. The sound continued. It's coming from inside the machine. But that doesn't make any logical sense. Equipment doesn't generate sound independent of mechanical operation. I'm documenting this because I need a record of what's happening. I need someone to know that I'm not hallucinating. The sound is real. The voices are real. University response. Email to Werner, November 9, 2025. James, your photographs were received and analyzed. The patterns you're describing don't match any known seismic data signature. Our lab concluded that the images appear to show human faces, which is statistically impossible from random seismic needle movements. The probability of the patterns you've documented occurring naturally is less than 1 in several billion. We're concerned about equipment malfunction or possible environmental contamination affecting the data streams. Additional equipment is being shipped to your location via helicopter on November 12th. Continue your protocols and maintain detailed logs. Maintenance log, November 10th, 2025. James Werner reports, Seismograph Unit 4 continued activity throughout the day and night. Audio output has increased in volume and clarity. The voices are now identifiable as human speech, though the language remains unrecognized. Werner attempted to record the audio output on backup recording equipment. Recordings show only static. The voices cannot be captured by conventional recording devices. However, they are audible to the human ear and clearly present in the room. Werner's mental state appears stable. He is maintaining protocols and documenting observations in a methodical manner. Recovered audio log, Mount St. Helens Station, November 11th, 2025, 3:47. I need to record this while it's happening. The voices have changed. They're speaking in English now. I don't know how, but they've switched to English. And they're speaking names. Dates. I'm hearing people's names and specific dates. Margaret Chen died November 1980. Robert Vanderpool died November 1999. Catherine Mills died November 2003. They're listing people who died in the Mount St. Helens eruption or in subsequent volcanic events. But some of the dates are future dates. I'm hearing names paired with dates that haven't occurred yet. Names of people I don't know. Dates that are months away, years away. The seismograph is drawing their faces as the voices speak their names. I've photographed every single one. I don't understand what this means. I don't understand what's trying to communicate with me through this equipment. University response. Email to Werner, November 11th, 2025. James, your latest report is very concerning. We're requesting that you photograph all seismograph readouts and transmit them immediately via satellite uplink. Additionally, we need you to attempt communication with the seismic data source. If the equipment is somehow receiving external signals or data transmissions, we need to identify the source. Do not engage in any dangerous activities. Simply document and report. Helicopter arrival has been moved up to November 12th, 10 a.m. Can you confirm you're able to receive the helicopter? Recovered audio log, Mount St. Helens Station, November 11th, 2025, 1833. I tried talking to them. The voices, I know how that sounds. I know I'm supposed to be a trained technician maintaining equipment, not talking to phantom voices. But they're real. They're present. They've been speaking continuously for 16 hours. So I asked them, out loud, I asked what they wanted. And they answered. They said they wanted me to listen. They said they wanted someone to know. They said the mountain isn't sleeping, it's remembering. And they said, this is what they actually said. The mountain remembers everyone who died in it, and everyone who will die in it. And we're all trying to tell you. We're all trying to speak from the future, to warn the present, to change what's already happened. Maintenance log, November 12th, 2025, 09:15. Helicopter arrival was delayed due to weather conditions. ETA now 14:30. Technician Werner reports that Seismograph Unit 4 continues to produce voice output and visual data. Werner has attempted communication with the phenomenon and reported receiving coherent responses. Werner's demeanor during radio check-in was unusually calm. He stated he understands what's happening now and that he's prepared for the helicopter team's arrival. Final recovered audio log, Mount St. Helens Station, November 12th, 2025, 12:22. The helicopter is coming at 2:30. I can see it on approach now, and I need to record this because once I leave this station, nobody's going to believe what happened here. The voices have stopped. The seismograph needle is frozen at a specific position. It's drawing a face, my face. Not like it predicted my face. I mean, it's accurate to how I look right now, today, this moment. The mountain knows who I am. The voices told me why. They said I was always supposed to be here on this date, at this time, to receive this message. They said I died in the 1980 eruption. And I will die in an eruption that hasn't happened yet. And every version of me across time is trapped in the seismic data, trying to warn the versions of me in other timelines. They said there's a cascade of eruptions coming. Not tomorrow, not next year, but eventually. And the mountain is patient. The mountain is trying to create a loop, a temporal feedback where people who will die in future eruptions are sending warnings backwards through time, carried in the geological record, encoded in the earth itself. I don't know if I believe this, but I know the helicopter crew won't believe me either. So I'm documenting it. And I'm telling you, whoever finds this record, the mountain isn't a mountain. It's a device. And it's been collecting data about human deaths for centuries, waiting for the moment when it could use that data to communicate backwards through time. The question is, has it already changed the future? Have the warnings already arrived and altered history? Or are they arriving now, for the first time? Which means the eruptions the voices were describing haven't occurred yet, and the mountain is still trying to prevent them. Incident report, November 12th, 2025, 15:45. Helicopter recovery team arrived at Mount St. Helens Station at 14:32. Technician James, Werner was located at the station in stable condition. All equipment was functional and operational. However, Seismograph Unit 4 displayed no unusual activity during team inspection. Equipment functioned normally throughout the recovery process. Technician Werner's personal audio logs were recovered and are being evaluated by university personnel. Werner declined medical evaluation, but agreed to psychological assessment upon return to Seattle. Psychiatric evaluation, University of Washington, November 13, 2025. Patient James Werner presents as articulate and coherent. No signs of acute psychiatric distress. Patient maintains that his logs are accurate and that the seismograph equipment produced voice output and temporal data. Patient is aware that no other personnel witnessed these phenomena and understands the skepticism surrounding his account. Patient states he does not require medication and is confident in his observations. Recommendation: continue outpatient monitoring. No involuntary psychiatric hold warranted at this time. Here's what I need to ask you. If equipment designed to detect the Earth's movements could theoretically receive signals from the future, from people who will die in catastrophes not yet occurred, would governments or universities admit to receiving those warnings? Would they try to prevent the predicted disasters? Or would they accept them as inevitable? And most importantly, if you could receive a message from your own death telling you the exact date and method of how you'll die, would you want to know? Because every seismic station in the Pacific Northwest is recording something. The question is whether anyone's actually listening to what the mountains are trying to tell us. I found the town by accident. I was supposed to be documenting abandoned logging settlements in the Tillamook rainforest for a documentary project, and my GPS coordinates were off by about 3 miles. When I emerged from the dense forest onto what used to be a logging road, I saw the mill. Not the remnants of a mill, an actual mill, standing there like someone had paused time in 1952 and simply left it running. My name is Michael. I was 34 years old when I walked into Idiotville, Oregon on a Tuesday in November. I'm 36 now, or at least that's what my driver's license says. I'm still not entirely convinced that 2 years have actually passed, but the calendar and the people around me insist they have. So I'm going to tell you what happened, and I'm going to ask you to figure out what's real, because I'm not sure I can anymore. Idiotville isn't on modern maps. It was founded in 1923 as a logging settlement and was abandoned en masse in 1952, which is where the historical record ends. Population was somewhere around 300 people when it was active. The town had a mill, a school, a general store, and about 40 houses arranged in neat rows. When I arrived, everything was still there, perfectly preserved. Like the community had simply decided to walk away one day and nobody had touched anything since. My camera crew, there were 4 of us, set up equipment and started filming. We were documenting the architecture, taking measurements, interviewing each other about what might have caused such a sudden exodus. It was interesting work. Creepy in that way old ghost towns are creepy, but professionally manageable. We filmed all afternoon, and as the sun started setting, we decided to camp on site rather than drive back to the nearest town. That's when things became strange. We set up tents near the mill, and around 5:47 p.m., the machinery inside started running. All of it. Saws began screaming, conveyor belts started moving, hydraulic systems engaged, all without anyone touching anything, all despite there being no power source we could identify. The 4 of us stood there listening to the mill operate, and nobody said anything because what do you say when a building that's been silent for 70 years suddenly wakes up? The acoustics, Sarah, my lead cinematographer, said. Went through the structure, creating vibrations that start industrial machinery? I interrupted. That coordinate perfectly at exactly the same time? The mill ran until 6:15 p.m. Then it stopped. Completely. Like someone had flipped a switch. And in the sudden silence, we heard something that made my stomach clench. Footsteps. On the metal catwalk inside the mill. Multiple sets of footsteps, the sound of work boots on metal grating. The mill was occupied. We should have left. We had a vehicle. We had supplies. We could have been back in civilization in 4 hours. But we didn't leave. We convinced ourselves it was an animal. Maybe a mountain lion or a bear had somehow learned to walk in patterns that mimicked human work boots. Maybe there was a hermit living in the structure. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation that we just hadn't thought of yet. So we stayed. We set up better equipment. We decided we'd film whatever was happening inside the mill at night. What we filmed changed everything. The footage showed the mill in full operation, dozens of workers moving through the structure with purposeful efficiency, feeding logs into saws, operating pulleys and conveyor systems, moving processed timber to loading areas. All of them wearing clothes from the 1940s. All of them performing actions with the choreography of people who'd done this same job thousands of times. And all of them completely translucent. We could see through them. We could see the machinery through their bodies. But they were aware of us. When we filmed them, they looked directly at the cameras. Their expressions were neutral, almost peaceful. They didn't try to communicate. They just acknowledged that we were there, observing them, and then they went back to work. The second night, something changed. When the mill started up at 5:47 p.m., one of the workers, a man with a distinctive scar on his face and a name tag that read Harold, walked directly toward my camera. He walked through the wall of the mill and stepped outside. He was still translucent, still ghostly, but he was looking at me, really looking at me, and he pointed at my watch. I looked down. The watch was broken. The hands were spinning frantically, cycling through all 24 hours. I looked at my phone. The date display was flickering between multiple dates. November 1952, November 2003, November 1998, November 2025. Time wasn't stable in Idiotville. Or rather, all the time periods were occupying the same space simultaneously. Harold pointed again, not at the watch, but at me. And I understood somehow that he was showing me something about my own timeline. He was trying to tell me that I was losing temporal coherence. That by being in Idiotville, I was becoming unstuck from my own chronological existence. We need to go, I said to my crew. Pack everything, now. They argued. Sarah wanted to film more. The other two cameramen wanted to investigate the mill. But something in my voice must have communicated actual danger, because they started packing. We had everything loaded in the vehicle within 20 minutes, and we drove away from Idiotville as fast as the old logging road allowed. Here's where it gets difficult to explain. We arrived at a hotel in Tillamook 3 hours later. We checked in, and I immediately went to my room and checked the date on my watch, my phone, the hotel phone. It was November 7th, 2025. The same date we'd left Idiotville. The same date we'd arrived. No time had passed. It had felt like we'd been driving for 3 hours, but the universe insisted that only about 90 minutes had elapsed. Over the next few weeks, we reviewed all the footage we'd collected. The footage showed the workers in the mill, but something was wrong with the temporal data embedded in the files. The timestamps were inconsistent. Some clips showed the mill operating in 1952. Other clips showed it operating in 1980. Other clips showed it operating in the present day. But all of them were recorded during our visit. All of them happened simultaneously in Idiotville's timeline. I started researching the town's history. The 1952 exodus was real, but the official story was incomplete. The truth, according to old newspaper archives and town records I found, was that the townspeople simply realized they were dead. There had been an accident at the mill in October 1952, a catastrophic structural failure that killed almost everyone in the community. But the survivors didn't recognize it as death. They thought they'd survived. So they continued living, continuing working, playing out the events of their final day over and over, every single day, not understanding that they were trapped in a recursive loop of their own deaths. The survivors who did realize what had happened, about 50 of them, walked into the forest and never came back. That's the 1952 exodus. Those weren't people abandoning the town. Those were people trying to escape from being dead, but not knowing it. Sarah quit the project. She wouldn't talk about why, but she moved to California and changed her phone number. One of the cameramen, David, called me 3 weeks later and said he'd noticed his watch had started malfunctioning again. The hands were moving wrong. The date kept shifting. He was starting to think that maybe he'd never actually left Idiotville. Maybe he was still there, still filming, and his memory of escape was just part of the recursive loop, a detail the town had inserted into his consciousness to keep him compliant. I tried to reassure him, but I've been noticing the same thing with my equipment. Video files that shouldn't exist are appearing on my hard drives. Footage of the mill operating, filmed from angles I've never set up cameras from. Clips showing dates that are months in the future. And I keep hearing the sound of work boots on metal grating in moments when I'm completely alone. Here's what I need to ask you. How many abandoned towns do you think exist in remote areas where the residents simply don't realize they're dead? How many places still operate perfectly, the machinery still running, the daily routines continuing? Because the people who died there haven't accepted that anything fundamental has changed. And if you were to visit one of these places, how would you know you were actually leaving? How could you be certain that your memory of escape isn't just another loop, another detailed delusion inserted by the town itself to keep you believing you got away? Because I'm starting to think I never left Idiotville. I think I've been here the whole time, watching my own documentary footage, confused about why it seems like I'm living in Tillamook in 2025 when I know, deep down, that I've been dead for 73 years. I was supposed to be there for 2 weeks. Routine maintenance on the automated weather equipment, standard data collection, basic facility inspection. I've done this job 12 times before at different island stations along the Washington coast. Destruction Island is small, about 30 acres of black rock jutting from the Pacific roughly 3 miles offshore. And it's one of the more remote assignments. The lighthouse is mostly automated now, but the government still maintains a weather station because the atmospheric data collected there is valuable for maritime safety and climate research. I was trained. I was prepared. I was completely unprepared for what actually happened. My name is Thomas Reeves. I've been working for NOAA for 8 years, and I've never filed a report like this one. I've never had an experience that contradicted basic physics in ways that official documentation can't accommodate. But I'm going to tell you exactly what happened on Destruction Island during the 2 weeks of November 3rd through November 17th, 2025, because someone needs to know the truth, and the official channels have made it clear they're not interested in recording it. The boat dropped me off on a Tuesday morning. Clear skies, moderate seas, the kind of day that makes island work feel almost pleasant. I unloaded my equipment, checked the facility, and began my systematic inspection of the weather monitoring systems. Everything appeared normal. The barometric pressure sensor was functioning correctly. The anemometer was recording wind speed accurately. The hygrometer was measuring humidity within expected parameters. I settled into the small living quarters, made some coffee, and started my routine data downloads. By 6 p.m. that evening, the barometer was reading something impossible. The atmospheric pressure was dropping at a rate that should have corresponded to a catastrophic hurricane formation. But the sky was clear. The wind was moderate. There was no indication of any weather system developing. I checked the equipment twice, recalibrated the sensors, and documented the anomaly. Equipment malfunction was the most likely explanation. Then I saw the lighthouse beam. It was rotating normally, sweeping across the ocean in the standard pattern. But its shadow was wrong. The shadow the beam cast on the rocks wasn't moving in synchronization with the light source. It was rotating in the opposite direction. I watched it for 20 minutes, telling myself it was an optical illusion, that my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fading light. But the shadow continued moving against the light source, creating this doubled illumination effect that shouldn't exist. The barometer kept dropping. By midnight, it was reading a pressure value that was literally lower than has ever been recorded on Earth. Physically impossible. And despite the equipment readings, the weather wasn't changing. The sky remained clear. The wind remained calm. But the island itself was changing. The temperature was dropping. Not gradually, in discrete steps. I'd be sitting in my quarters, and suddenly the temperature would plummet by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it would hold steady. Then it would drop another 10 degrees. Like something was incrementally removing heat from the environment. I tried radioing the mainland. No response. The radio was functioning. I could hear static. I could hear carrier waves. But no one answered my calls. I tried the emergency beacon. Same result. Working equipment. No response from any receiving station. It was like the island existed in a communication void. The second night, I experienced my first physical manifestation. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep because of the temperature fluctuations and the anxiety about my malfunctioning equipment, when I felt pain in my chest. Intense, localized pain directly over my heart. I got up, turned on the lights, and examined myself. My skin looked fine, nothing visible. But the pain was intense, and it was getting worse. I took ibuprofen. The pain didn't respond. I was about to use the emergency medical kit when the pain suddenly stopped. Completely, like someone had flipped a switch. I checked my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked normal. My skin looked normal. But something was fundamentally wrong with my reflection. It was slightly out of sync with my movements. When I moved my left arm, my reflection's left arm moved a fraction of a second later. When I tilted my head, the reflection tilted at a delayed interval. My reflection was moving in a different timeline than my body. By the third day, I was documenting phenomena that violated every physical law I understood. The rain was falling upward from the ground. I watched it with my own eyes. Water vapor rising from the rocky soil, ascending into the sky, defying gravity. But I could feel rain on my face. There was moisture in the air. The upward falling rain was real, and it was simultaneously impossible. The barometer was now reading values so extreme that the needle was hitting the mechanical stops. The equipment couldn't measure how low the pressure had actually become. I started experiencing symptoms I initially attributed to altitude sickness or some kind of medical emergency. Severe headaches, nosebleeds, disorientation. But the island is only about 200 feet above sea level. Altitude shouldn't have been a factor. On the fourth day, I found the geometric symbols. They appeared on the rocks outside the weather station, just carved into the stone. Perfect geometric patterns, sacred symbols from the Coast Salish people, symbols associated with death and the spirit world. I didn't carve them. Nobody was on the island except me. They simply appeared. Each morning, there would be new symbols, carved with precision into different rocks, and each one was more detailed than the previous days. I started keeping detailed documentation of everything, filling notebook after notebook with observations, the barometer readings, the temperature fluctuations, the time distortions, the weight changes. By the fifth day, I noticed my body was getting lighter. I weighed myself on the digital scale in the facility, 158 pounds. I weighed myself again that evening, 155 pounds. The next morning, 152 pounds. I wasn't eating less. I wasn't sweating excessively. I was literally losing mass for no discernible reason. The island was teaching me something through these phenomena, or something was teaching me using the island as a medium. The barometric pressure represented the weight of accumulated violence that had occurred on this rock. The upward rain represented something's blood falling skyward. The geometric symbols represented a catalog of death, and my body's mass loss was synchronization. The island was making me compatible with what it was trying to communicate. On the seventh day, I saw them, the shadows in the fog. Not fog that was naturally occurring, the weather was still clear, but fog that was manifesting in isolated patches around the island's perimeter. And within that fog, I could see shapes, human-shaped shadows that looked like they were climbing up from the ocean itself. Dozens of them, hundreds. The faces were too dark to see, but the outlines were unmistakably human, and they were all facing the island, looking directly at me. I recognized what they represented. Destruction Island is where the Desthemale tribe was massacred in 1787. The Tlingit were attacked by European traders and sailors in what became known as one of the earliest recorded acts of genocide in the Pacific Northwest. Dozens of indigenous people were killed on this rock. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Their spirits never received proper rest. Their deaths were never properly acknowledged by the government that now maintained a weather station on top of their gravesite. The shadows in the fog began moving toward the shore. Not menacingly, with purpose, with intention. They were pulling themselves up from the water, and I realized that every shadow represented a death. Every face in the fog was someone who had died here, and they were all converging on the weather station where I stood. I ran inside and locked the doors, not because I thought locks would stop spirits, because I needed to feel like I was doing something, anything, to maintain the illusion of control. Through the window, I watched the shadows climb the rocks. They didn't break through the doors. They didn't try to force entry. They simply surrounded the building, every window filled with those dark faces, and they began speaking. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. But I understood the meaning perfectly. They were telling me I was standing on mass graves. They were telling me this island was a tomb that nobody acknowledged. They were telling me that my presence here, maintaining weather equipment, collecting data about atmospheric conditions above their bones, my presence was complicity in the erasure of their deaths. On the 8th day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to survive 2 weeks on this island. I was going to accept that something fundamental had changed, that I was no longer operating in the reality I'd thought I inhabited. I wrote down everything I'd experienced. I documented all my observations. And I walked to the lighthouse and climbed to the top. I didn't jump. I want to be clear about that. I climbed to the top of the lighthouse, and I looked out at the ocean, and I waited. The shadows came up out of the water and surrounded the lighthouse tower. The ones who had died here, the ones whose deaths had been forgotten, they rose up around me. And they showed me what death felt like from their perspective. They showed me what it felt like to be murdered on a foreign shore. They showed me what it felt like to have your death erased from history, to become a footnote in some trader's diary rather than a human being who mattered. When the rescue helicopter found me on the 13th day, I was sitting in the lighthouse, completely dehydrated, my body temperature at dangerous levels, my eyes staring at nothing. I had survived on the island by maintaining the body's basic functions, but my mind had left. Or maybe it had finally arrived somewhere it was meant to be. Here's what I need to ask you. How many places exist in this country where massacres occurred and were never properly acknowledged? How many mass graves are built over with government facilities, tourist attractions, or urban development? And if the spirits of the dead have learned to manipulate weather equipment to communicate their presence, to force recognition of their erasure, what happens when that technology reaches critical mass? When every weather station in every region of indigenous death starts broadcasting the same message at the same time? They're not going to believe me. I know this already. I'm sitting in this detention facility outside of Tacoma, and I know that everything I'm about to tell you is going to sound like the hallucinations of someone who's dehydrated, malnourished, and traumatized. But it happened. I watched it happen. I felt it happening to my own body, and I need someone to know the truth before they deport me back across the border, and this whole story disappears. My name is Carlos. I'm 34 years old from Oaxaca, Mexico. I came north looking for work like thousands of others do. I was contacted by a labor contractor who said there was seasonal work picking commercial ferns and moss in the Sol Duke Valley near Forks, Washington. The work was legitimate, he said. The pay was decent. The housing was basic but functional. He didn't mention anything about the forest being alive in ways that normal forests aren't alive. There were 14 of us on the crew when we started. All men, all migrants, all desperate enough to work in the rainforest for wages that barely qualified as legal. The contractor drove us about 20 miles inland from Forks, and we started hiking into the Sol Duke Valley. The forest there is ancient, prehistoric. The trees are so massive that you feel like an insect walking beneath them. The ferns grow in layers. Some of them are taller than houses. The moss covers everything, so thick that the ground feels spongy beneath your feet, like you're walking on living tissue instead of soil. Our job was to harvest commercial ferns and moss. The floral industry uses massive amounts of this material for arrangements and decorative displays. We were the people who provided the raw material that shows up in bouquets and wreaths in grocery stores across the country. We worked 10 hours a day, filling large burlap sacks with harvested plant material, and the contractor would weigh them at the end of each day. We were paid by weight. We had basic shelter, plastic tarps strung between trees, and we received one meal a day, usually rice with some kind of beans. By the third day, I noticed something wrong with our harvest. The sacks we'd filled on the first day, which we stacked at the collection point, they were heavier on day 3 than they had been on day 1. We hadn't added anything to them. The weight gain was significant. I'd estimate about 15% heavier. I mentioned it to the contractor. He said it was moisture absorption from the fog, that the material was absorbing water and becoming heavier. It made sense. The forest was incredibly humid. Everything was damp, But then the material started moving. On day 4, one of the younger guys, Miguel, opened one of the sacks to check something, and he found something inside that shouldn't have been there. A hand. Human hand. Palm side up. Fingers slightly curled. Completely preserved. Not decomposed. Attached to nothing but sitting at the top of the sack like someone had deliberately placed it there. Miguel screamed. We all came running. The contractor looked at the hand, then looked at us, and he said we needed to keep working. He told us that sometimes the forest did strange things, and we shouldn't ask questions about things we didn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that hand. Where had it come from? How had it gotten into the sack? Had it grown there? Had something put it there deliberately? By morning, I convinced myself it was probably just a mummified human remain, ancient indigenous burial site material that had been exposed by our harvesting. It was disturbing, but it was explainable. By day 6, we started finding more remains. Not just hands, fingers, pieces of scalp, what looked like human teeth embedded in moss bundles. And the harvest material itself was changing. The ferns we were picking were growing back, not gradually over weeks, overnight. We'd harvest a section of forest, and the next morning, the ferns would have regrown to full height in the exact same location. It was like the forest was being harvested and harvesting itself simultaneously, creating an infinite source of material that required only our labor to maintain. Then the physical changes started happening to the crew. Jose, one of the guys who'd been with us since day 1, came to me on day 7 and showed me his hands. His fingernails had started thickening. They were becoming less like human nails and more like something chitinous, almost translucent, with a faint green tint. He was terrified. We went to the contractor and asked for a ride back to town. He refused. He said we had a contract. We had committed to 2 weeks of work, and we were going to fulfill that contract or we wouldn't be paid. We couldn't leave. The forest was too dense. We didn't know which direction was out. Our only option was to keep working and hope that the physical changes stopped, that they were some kind of temporary reaction to stress or malnutrition or exposure. But they didn't stop. By day 9, half the crew was showing visible signs of transformation. Skin texture changing, eyes taking on a faint iridescence, voices becoming slightly slower, words drawn out like we were speaking through water, and everyone's fingers and toes were starting to produce a kind of sticky sap. I realized what was happening on day 10. I was harvesting ferns in a section of forest we'd worked 4 days earlier, and I found the remains of Miguel, or what used to be Miguel. His body was rooted to the ground. His skin had taken on the texture of bark. His fingers had merged together into something that looked like branches. But he was still alive. His eyes tracked me. He tried to speak, but the sound that came out was the rustling of leaves. He was becoming part of the forest. The forest was converting him into plant matter while maintaining enough of his consciousness that he was aware of what was happening. I ran. I left the work site at midday without telling anyone. I just dropped my harvesting tools and ran into the forest. The contractor didn't try to stop me. I don't think he cared. We were just labor inputs to him. Replaceable. And if the forest was converting us into its own biological material, that just meant fewer bodies for him to manage. I ran for what felt like hours. The forest was thick and disorienting, but I could hear the highway in the distance. The sound of traffic became my navigation point. I stumbled through ferns and moss and root systems, and I started feeling the same sensations that had been affecting the crew. My skin was becoming sensitive. Sticky, I could feel myself beginning to root, my feet sending out exploratory tendrils into the soil beneath me. The transformation was accelerating in me. Maybe because I was panicking, maybe because the forest punishes escape attempts by making the conversion faster. I burst out of the forest onto the shoulder of Highway 1001, covered in moss and fern material, and things that were starting to look like plant growth emerging from my skin. A Border Patrol agent was the one who found me. He almost didn't stop. He thought I was just homeless or drugged out. But he called for medical assistance, and they brought me to the hospital in Forks, where they cleaned me up and treated my wounds and asked me increasingly skeptical questions about what had happened. The physical transformation stopped once I was out of the forest. The skin cleared up, the sap production stopped, the tendrils retracted. My fingernails went back to normal. By the time I was well enough to talk to authorities, there was no physical evidence that anything unusual had happened to me. The Border Patrol agent decided I was an immigration violation rather than a victim of something impossible. So here I am, in detention, waiting for deportation. But the other crew members are still out there. 13 men who are probably still in various states of transformation in the Sol Duc Valley. Or they've already completed the process and are now just part of the forest, their consciousness distributed through root systems and fungal networks, still aware but no longer human. The contractor is still out there, still recruiting labor crews, still sending people into that forest. The question I need you to answer is this: how many labor camps exist in remote areas where workers are being systematically converted into something other than human? How many industries depend on the exploitation of migrants in locations where no one is watching? And if the forest itself has learned to harvest human beings the way we harvest it, if the ecosystem has developed a predatory strategy that targets vulnerable people, who's responsible for stopping it? Who's responsible for the people who are still out there putting down roots they didn't choose? This is my formal statement regarding the incidents that occurred at the Port Angeles Ferry Terminal between November 1st and November 15th, 2025. I am providing this statement voluntarily, understanding that it may be used in disciplinary proceedings, criminal investigation, or both. My name is Officer Daniel Hutchins. I have worked for U.S. Customs and Border Protection for 19 years. I have never filed a report questioning the nature of reality itself. Today, I have no choice. I was assigned to the Port Angeles Ferry Terminal as a senior customs officer. The facility processes approximately 2,000 passengers daily traveling between Washington State and Victoria, British Columbia. Security screening includes vehicle inspection, personnel interviews, and advanced scanning technology, including X-ray equipment, spectrographic analysis, and quantum-level security scanners that were installed in 2022 as part of a Department of Homeland Security initiative. I need to provide context for what happened. In 1999, Ahmed Ressam was arrested at this terminal, attempting to smuggle explosives into the United States in preparation for the Millennium bombing. It was one of the most significant terrorism prevention operations in U.S. history. The arrest led to enhanced security protocols at this facility. It also led to something else, something that nobody officially acknowledges: a temporal scar. That's the only way I can describe it. When the arrest occurred, when Ressam was intercepted, when the bombing was prevented, something broke in the causality structure at that specific location. It created a wound in cause and effect. And for the past 25 years, that wound has been slowly getting worse. The advanced security scanners at this terminal don't just detect contraband. They detect probability. They were designed to identify threats by scanning for weapons, explosives, and dangerous materials. But the quantum-level scanners, the ones installed in 2022, they're sensitive enough to detect things that haven't happened yet. They detect future threats, future contraband, future crimes. The technology reads quantum probability states and converts them into visual data that our security personnel can interpret. When I first started noticing the anomalies, I assumed it was equipment malfunction. A passenger would come through the scanner, and we'd detect explosives in their vehicle. We'd search thoroughly. We'd find nothing. No weapons, no explosives, nothing. But the scanner readout was unambiguous. There were explosives present, just not in this timeline yet. I reported it to my supervisor. The response was to log the events and continue screening. By my third week working with the advanced scanners, I realized what was actually happening. We weren't detecting current threats. We were detecting threats from slightly different probability branches. We were seeing weapons that existed in adjacent timelines. We were preventing crimes that hadn't occurred yet by stopping people who might commit them in alternate versions of reality. The procedure was simple. If the scanner detected future contraband, we'd detain the passenger for secondary screening. Invariably, during secondary screening, the passenger would become hostile. They'd attempt to assault officers or flee the facility. We'd use force to restrain them. And then something extraordinary would happen. The timeline would collapse. The passenger would vanish. We'd find evidence suggesting that the person we just detained had never existed. No record in any database. No identification that could be verified. No pattern of entry that matched the secondary screening log. I mentioned this to the other senior officers. They knew what I was describing. They'd been experiencing the same thing. They called it collapsing probabilities. When we detained someone based on future threat detection, we were essentially choosing which timeline continued to exist. In the timeline where we let them through, they committed an attack. So we prevented that timeline from occurring by detaining them, which caused that version of reality to collapse, which erased the person from existence. We were preventing terrorism by creating non-existence. By November 1st, I had personally collapsed 43 probability branches. 43 potential versions of reality where someone was going to commit a crime had been prevented by my actions, which meant those 43 people had been retroactively deleted from existence. I never saw them again. I never saw any record of them. They simply ceased to have ever been. Then I made a discovery that changed everything. I was reviewing the scanning data from a particularly active day, and I noticed something in the readouts. The scanner had detected a future threat in one of the scanning lanes. Secondary screening was initiated. The passenger became hostile. We detained them. The probability collapsed. Standard procedure. Except the collapsed probability had a timestamp, a future timestamp. The version of reality we just erased was scheduled to occur in approximately 6 months. We'd prevented something that hadn't happened yet, in a timeline that hadn't even begun yet. I realized that the scanner wasn't just detecting adjacent probability branches. It was detecting cascading causality, events that would trigger other events in geometric progression. And by collapsing individual probabilities, we were preventing massive chains of causality from ever occurring. I requested the historical data on all probability collapses since the advanced scanners were installed. I received 847 documented cases over 3 years. I cross-referenced them with news reports of prevented terrorist attacks, failed bombing attempts, and foiled security threats. There was no correlation. The probability collapses weren't matching documented threat prevention. We weren't just stopping real terrorists who happened to be carrying future weapons. We were collapsing entire probability branches to prevent attacks that might have occurred in those branches. The scanner had essentially become a causality weapon, and the government had been using it to erase people from existence for 3 years. I brought this to my supervisor's attention on November 8th. His response was to schedule me for psychiatric evaluation. He said I was experiencing delusions. He said I needed to take leave. He said I should reconsider my interpretation of the data. Officially, he said, none of those things happened. My supervisor denies we ever had that conversation. There's no record of my email requesting historical data. There's no documentation of my concerns being raised. But I know what I experienced. I know that on November 10th, I was assigned to one of the advanced scanning lanes. I was running a routine screening when a passenger came through the scanner and the equipment detected a future threat. According to the readout, this passenger was going to commit a mass casualty attack in March 2026. The attack would kill 47 people. The probability was 94% certainty. I initiated secondary screening. The passenger became hostile. I called for backup. We restrained the individual, and I was about to authorize the probability collapse when I looked at the passenger's face. It was me. Older, maybe by 5 or 6 years, with a scar across my left temple I don't currently have. The future version of myself was looking at me with an expression of complete resignation, like he knew what was about to happen. I didn't authorize the collapse. I released the passenger. My supervisor was furious. He demanded to know why I'd released someone with a 94% probability of committing mass murder. I told him the truth. He had me escorted from the facility and placed on immediate suspension pending psychiatric evaluation. But here's what I understand now. The scanning technology isn't just detecting future threats. It's creating them. Every time we collapse a probability to prevent a theoretical attack, we're triggering a cascading set of events that generates a new, more certain threat. We're not preventing terrorism. We're manufacturing it. We're creating the conditions for future attacks by our attempts to prevent current ones. And the older version of me that I saw in the scanning lane, the version with the scar and the defeated expression, he already knows that. He's lived through the cascade. He knows what happened after I released him. He knows what he became. And he came back through that terminal to give me a warning, which I almost prevented by collapsing his probability. I'm being discharged from my position. I'm being referred for psychiatric evaluation. And I deserve it. I'm clearly delusional. The advanced scanners are functioning perfectly normally. There is no temporal scar at the Port Angeles facility. There are no probability collapses. There is no method by which we could be detecting and preventing crimes that haven't occurred yet. Except that starting tomorrow, 47 people who exist today won't exist by March 2026. Because I didn't collapse the probability of my older self. Because I allowed that version of the future to continue existing. And in allowing one future to exist, I've guaranteed that everything that future contained will eventually occur. Here's the question I need you to consider. If security technology could predict your future crimes with 94% certainty, would you want to be stopped? If the government could prevent you from committing an act of terrorism that you haven't committed yet, in a timeline you haven't entered yet, would that erasure be justice or murder? And if collapsing one probability creates a new, more violent probability in its place, are we actually preventing terrorism, or are we just displacing it into futures where it becomes unavoidable? Because somewhere in March 2026, something is going to happen. And it's going to happen because we tried too hard to prevent it. And I'm going to be involved. And I deserve to be. Because I made the choice to preserve one timeline over another. not knowing which timeline I was choosing to save. You arrive in Stehekin on a clear November morning, the kind of day that makes you forget why people avoid this place during winter. The ferry cuts through pristine water, mountains rising on both sides of Lake Chelan, and you feel like you're entering a postcard rather than one of the most isolated communities in Washington state. You're Dr. Sarah Chen, a climate researcher from the University of Washington, and you've been granted permission to spend the winter studying how isolated populations maintain psychological resilience during extended communication blackouts. Stehekin is perfect for your research. Population 87. No road access, accessible only by boat, float plane, or a brutal 27-mile hiking trail. For 4 months, these people exist in voluntary exile from the rest of the world. The locals greet you warmly. They're accustomed to researchers, tourists, and people seeking isolation. They show you to your rented cabin, small, well-maintained, with a wood-burning stove and enough supplies to last through February. You begin your interviews immediately. You want to capture baseline psychological data before the winter darkness settles in completely. You sit with residents in their homes, in the general store, on the dock. You ask them about their mental health, their coping mechanisms, their reasons for choosing this level of isolation. They all tell you similar stories. They came for peace. They stayed because they found it. But by November 7th, you start noticing something odd in your conversations. Multiple residents mention the darkness. Not darkness as in the absence of daylight that's expected in November in a mountain valley. They're describing the darkness itself as present, physical. One woman, Linda, describes it as heavy darkness. Another man, Michael, says it feels like the darkness is learning. You attribute this to seasonal affective disorder, to the psychology of isolation, to the power of suggestion in a small community. You document it in your notes as a psychological phenomenon rather than a physical one. By November 10th, you can't ignore it anymore. You step outside your cabin at 4 p.m. and immediately sense what they mean. The darkness isn't just the absence of light. It has density. When you move through it, you feel resistance, like you're pushing through something physical. Your flashlight beam doesn't travel as far as it should. The light gets absorbed by the darkness rather than reflecting off surfaces. You shine the beam directly at a tree 30 feet away. The tree should be clearly visible. Instead, the light simply disappears into the darkness about 15 feet from you, swallowed completely. You spend that night taking measurements with specialized equipment. Light sensors, atmospheric readers, temperature gauges. Everything becomes inert the moment you direct it into areas of high darkness concentration. The devices simply stop functioning. Remove them from the darkness, and they work perfectly again. It's like the darkness is creating a zone where certain physical laws don't apply. You document everything methodically, trying to maintain scientific objectivity even as your anxiety climbs. The residents notice your concern. They seem unsurprised by it. They've been watching the darkness develop for weeks, they tell you. It started slowly in late October, just slightly denser than normal darkness. Now it's becoming overwhelming. Some of them have started avoiding going outside after sunset. Others venture into it deliberately, for reasons they can't articulate. You interview Michael on November 12th after he returns from a 3-hour walk into the darkness. His body temperature is 93.2 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 5 degrees below normal. His voice is different, quieter. His movements are slower, more deliberate. When you photograph him, you notice his shadow is moving wrong. It's moving against his body position, like it's operating on a different timeline than the rest of him. By November 15th, You can no longer deny what's happening. The darkness now comprises approximately 70% of the nighttime environment, and it's spreading into daylight hours. Large sections of Stehekin are completely obscured by midday. The darkness has developed a color, not black, but a deep purple-black void that hurts to look at directly. When you stare into it for too long, you begin to lose your sense of spatial orientation. Your brain can't process what it's seeing because it's not seeing photons bouncing off surfaces. It's seeing nothing. Absolute nothing. The color of deep space. You call the university on November 18th via satellite phone. Your voice sounds strange to your own ears. You're having difficulty explaining what's happening because language doesn't have words for this phenomenon. You describe it as a tangible substance, a physical medium of darkness that possesses resistance and the ability to absorb light. Your research coordinator's response is skeptical. He suggests equipment malfunction. You insist that everything is working perfectly. You're the one who's not working perfectly. You can feel it. Your body temperature has dropped 2 degrees since you arrived. Your shadow doesn't always match your movements. Sometimes you catch your reflection in windows, and it's looking at you with an expression of sad recognition, like it knows something you haven't accepted yet. You stop leaving your cabin by November 20th. The darkness has consumed nearly everything outside. When you open your door, you see nothing. Not darkness as the absence of light, but darkness as a presence, a void that reaches toward you. You can feel it trying to enter your cabin, testing the boundaries of your walls. At night, you hear movement outside, sounds of people walking, but their footsteps are wrong. They're moving in patterns that don't match the geography of Stehekin. They're walking on vertical surfaces. They're walking through buildings. They're walking in multiple directions simultaneously, creating an impossible acoustic landscape. The satellite phone stops working on November 23rd. You try calling the university. You try calling emergency services in Seattle. Nothing. The equipment functions perfectly. You can see the signal strength display. You can see the battery indicator. But no one answers. No one receives your calls. It's like you're broadcasting into a void. You leave messages anyway. You describe what's happening. You describe how the residents are changing, how their body temperatures keep dropping, how their shadows move wrong, how they spend more and more time in the darkness voluntarily, how you're afraid that if you go outside, you won't come back the same. By November 27th, you've accepted something. The darkness is intelligent, not conscious in the way humans are conscious, but possessing some kind of intentional presence. It's learning. It's spreading methodically. It's consuming the community gradually, and no one is trying to escape. The residents have stopped trying to live normally. They've accepted the darkness. They've become part of it. You've watched Linda Wong's body temperature drop to 89. 89 degrees. You've watched Michael's shadow develop consciousness. You've watched them walking into the darkness and emerging changed, quieter, emptier, more compatible with the void. You realize on November 29th that you're changing too. Your temperature is down to 94 degrees. Your shadow moved against you this morning. You went outside without thinking about it, and you spent 3 hours in the darkness before you remembered where you were. When you came back inside, you couldn't remember what daylight looked like. You can't remember the color of the sky. You can't remember why you came to Stehekin. You only know that the darkness is patient and it's right, and it's going to consume this entire valley eventually, and you're going to help it happen. The question you need to answer is this: In places where isolation is total, where no outside help can arrive, where communication with the external world fails. What happens when something develops that feeds on disconnection? What happens when darkness learns that humans are a resource to be consumed slowly rather than quickly? And most importantly, how many isolated communities already have their own versions of this phenomenon developing? And how would we ever know if communication had already been severed? You sit in your cabin now, waiting. The darkness is pressing against your windows. Soon, you'll open the door. Soon, you'll walk outside and never come back inside. And that will be correct. That will be exactly what should happen. My name is Detective James Morrison, and I've been investigating the disappearance of the Cascade Pass expedition team for 6 months. What I'm about to tell you contradicts every official statement made by the National Park Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the hiking community. But I have evidence. I have recovered equipment. I have video footage that defies explanation. And I have questions that no government agency wants answered. The expedition began on November 1st, 2025. 5 experienced cavers, people with decades of combined spelunking experience, decided to map the old rail tunnel system beneath Cascade Pass. The tunnels were originally excavated in the 1920s as part of an abandoned rail project. The system had been partially explored and documented, but significant sections remained unmapped. The team's goal was to create a comprehensive survey and produce geological data about the tunnel formation. It was supposed to be a 2-week project. They never emerged. I was contacted by the families after 8 days of no communication. Search and rescue teams were mobilized. Helicopter sweeps found nothing. Ground teams entered the tunnels from the known access points and discovered that the expedition's entry point had collapsed. The team was sealed inside. Recovery operations began immediately. What rescue teams found inside the tunnel system contradicted everything we understood about the structure. The documented tunnel system extends approximately 3.2 miles beneath Cascade Pass. Rescue teams followed the expedition's marked route for the first 1.8 miles without incident. The tunnels showed standard geological formations: granite walls, conventional limestone deposits, evidence of deliberate excavation consistent with 1920s railroad construction techniques. Then the markers ended. The expedition had continued deeper than any documented survey indicated. Rescue teams followed the expedition's equipment and footprints into unmapped sections. This is where things became impossible to explain. The tunnel walls changed character. The excavation marks that had been visible in the documented sections gave way to something else. Claw marks. Massive gouges in solid granite that looked like they'd been created by something with claws the size of railroad spikes. The scratches were deep enough to expose fresh granite beneath the oxidized surface. Fresh, meaning they'd been created recently, not decades ago. The undocumented tunnel sections showed geological impossibilities. Granite that had been excavated from the inside out, creating chambers that shouldn't structurally exist. The passages descended at angles that would have required the tunnels to extend hundreds of feet below Lake Chelan, which is physically impossible given the geographic layout of Cascade Pass. Yet the measurements were consistent. The tunnels actually existed in 3-dimensional space that violated the topology of the mountain itself. Inside one of these impossible chambers, rescue teams found the expedition's equipment: cameras, recording devices, mapping instruments, all functioning, all showing consistent, documented data. But the data was impossible. The cameras had recorded footage in chambers that didn't appear on any rescue team's instruments. The distance markers showed locations that would place the expedition members hundreds of feet above their actual position. The geological surveys indicated mineral compositions that don't exist in the Cascade Range. I reviewed the recovered GoPro footage personally. What I saw required me to take a 3-day leave of absence to process the implications. The expedition was systematically exploring the tunnel system, documenting as they descended. For the first 2 hours of footage, everything appeared normal. Standard cave exploration. Technical difficulty, but nothing unusual. Then the tone changed. The expedition encountered a section of tunnel that showed recent excavation. Not recent as in last decade. Recent as in last year. Last month. The claw marks were fresh. The stone debris showed no weathering. And the tunnels were being actively enlarged. The rock walls were showing evidence of continuous excavation, like something was still working on expanding these passages. One team member, identified as Marcus, said on the recording, "This wasn't here before. This tunnel wasn't on any historical surveys, and it's being actively mined." They continued exploring. They documented the progression of the tunnel deeper into the mountain. The passages became larger, more deliberate. The claw marks became more organized, more purposeful. They were watching a tunnel system that was being constructed by something that wasn't human, using techniques that weren't conventional excavation in a direction that didn't make geological sense. Then the first team member disappeared. The footage shows 4 people walking down a passage, and suddenly there are 3 people. The missing team member, David, simply ceases to exist in the footage. No fall, no sudden disappearance, no explanation. One moment he's walking behind the group, the next moment the group has reformed and David is gone. The remaining team members don't seem to register his absence immediately. They keep walking, keep talking, keep exploring, as if David's disappearance is normal. Then Marcus stops and says, "Where's David?" And the other 2 team members seem confused, like they'd forgotten he was ever there. The remaining 3 continued exploring. They descended deeper into the tunnel system. The passages became larger and more organized. The claw marks evolved into patterns, not random scratching but intentional designs. Archaeological symbols, geometric precision. The team was finding evidence that something had been systematically developing this tunnel network, and the development had been ongoing for longer than human history. Marcus began theorizing on camera that they were looking at an ancient tunnel system, not ancient in terms of centuries, ancient in terms of geological time. He suggested, with increasing agitation, that the tunnels might predate human civilization, that they might predate the mountain itself. The team was exploring something that had been sealed or hidden beneath the earth for millennia. The second team member disappeared shortly after. Again, the footage shows gradual erasure. One moment there are 3 people, then there are 2. And the remaining team members don't seem to notice the absence. They keep exploring, keep documenting, keep descending. The final 2 members, Marcus and Sarah, continued into the deepest sections of the tunnel system. The last footage shows them standing in a chamber so massive that their flashlights can't find the ceiling. The walls are perfectly smooth. Not granite, not limestone. Something else. Something that looks almost metallic, but isn't metal. The walls are covered with symbols. Thousands of them. Millions. The symbols are organized in patterns that suggest data. Information. A library carved into the walls of an impossible chamber. Marcus says on the recording, "We're not in a tunnel. We're inside something. We're inside a structure." Sarah asks, "How old is this?" And Marcus responds, "Older than the mountain, older than the continent. I think we're inside something that's been waiting." The footage ends. The camera continues recording, but both team members have left the frame. You can hear footsteps moving deeper into the chamber. You can hear voices, but they're speaking in a language that isn't English, isn't any documented human language. The sounds are rhythmic, almost musical, and they seem to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The recording continues for another 47 minutes. Just audio. Just the sound of movement in the dark. Then silence. Complete silence. The camera continues recording in that silence for another 6 hours before the battery dies. When rescue teams entered this chamber, they found the expedition's final camera exactly where the footage ended. But they found no evidence of the team members. No bodies. No remains. No indication that any humans had been present. The chamber itself was smaller than it appeared in the footage. The walls were standard granite. The symbols were nowhere to be found. The impossible geometry resolved back into conventional cave formation. But the equipment's data remained consistent. The distance measurements indicated a chamber that should be physically impossible. The geological surveys registered materials that shouldn't exist. The audio recordings captured sounds that our acoustic specialists still can't identify or classify. I've spent 6 months reviewing this evidence. I've consulted with geologists, physicists, archaeologists, and specialists in fields that don't have official names. The consensus is that either the expedition's equipment was fundamentally malfunctioning, or the tunnels beneath Cascade Pass contain something that violates basic physical principles. The tunnels have been officially sealed by the National Park Service. The entrance has been collapsed deliberately. The area is now marked as geologically unstable and closed to public access. All official documentation of the expedition has been classified. The families of the missing team members have been discouraged from pursuing investigation. But here's what I need to ask you. If there are structures beneath the earth that predate human civilization, if there are tunnel systems that exist in impossible geometric configurations, if there are chambers carved with information in languages we don't understand, how many of them exist in remote locations where nobody's looking? How many mountains in the Pacific Northwest contain sealed tunnels that the government is actively concealing? And most importantly, if something excavated these tunnels from the inside out, if something has been living and working beneath the earth in the darkness for geological timescales, what happens when we accidentally find it and remind it that the surface world exists? The Cascade Pass tunnels are sealed now, but the excavation marks suggest that whatever created them is still working, still expanding, still developing a network that extends in directions we can't measure. And I think the expedition team found something in that chamber. I think they made contact with whatever built those tunnels. And I think they're still down there, learning a language that doesn't belong to this world. I'm going to die on this mountain. I've accepted that. I'm not being dramatic or fatalistic. I'm being honest about what's happening to me. And I need someone to know the truth before my body becomes just another geological sample in the volcanic record of Mount St. Helens. My name is David Chambers. I was born in 1987. I've worked as a volcanologist for the U.S. Geological Survey for 12 years. I've studied active volcanic systems across the Pacific Ring of Fire. I've spent my career trying to understand how mountains communicate, how they warn us before they explode, how they give us windows to predict catastrophe. I came to Mount St. Helens for what was supposed to be a routine 3-week maintenance rotation at the automated monitoring station. That was 6 months ago. I'm still here. I'll always be here now. The station sits at 4,800 feet on the mountain's eastern slope. It's a small facility. Basically a reinforced concrete bunker with seismic equipment, gas sensors, GPS monitoring systems, and communication equipment. The station's primary purpose is to detect any precursory activity that might indicate volcanic instability. Hairline fractures in rock, subtle shifts in seismic activity, changes in gas emissions, early warning signs that the mountain might be waking up. I arrived in late November 2024. The weather was clear. The mountain was quiet. Everything appeared normal and stable. I settled into the routine of maintenance, running diagnostics on the equipment, replacing sensors, downloading data, checking communication systems. Standard work. The kind of job that's boring most of the time, necessary all the time, and absolutely critical when something actually goes wrong. By my second week, I noticed something unusual in the seismic data. There was activity that shouldn't have been there. Not the kind of activity that indicates volcanic movement. Something else. Something that looked almost like sound waves traveling through the rock. I recalibrated the equipment. The readings persisted. I documented it and submitted a report to my supervisor. The response was to monitor the situation and report any changes. The readings intensified on day 16. I was in the main lab reviewing data when I heard it. A sound coming from the seismic equipment. Not mechanical malfunction. Actual sound. Voices. Speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but with unmistakable human vocalization patterns. I checked every piece of equipment. Everything was functioning normally. The voices were real. They were being transmitted through the seismic monitoring system like the rock itself was broadcasting a message. I documented everything obsessively. I recorded the audio. I analyzed the frequency patterns. I attempted to correlate the voice activity with seismic readings. Over the next week, the pattern became clear. The voices were speaking names, specific names, paired with dates. Margaret Chen died November 1980. Robert Vanderpool died November 1999. Catherine Mills died November 2003. The voices were cataloging people who had died in volcanic events, people whose deaths connected to Mount St. Helens. But some of the dates were in the future. I was hearing names of people who haven't died yet, dates that are months or years away. The mountain was broadcasting information about deaths that haven't occurred yet, deaths that exist only in probability space, in timelines that haven't solidified into reality. I tried to communicate back. I felt insane doing it. But I spoke to the mountain. I asked what it wanted. I asked what these voices were trying to tell me. And the mountain answered. Not through the seismic equipment, through my own body. I felt it first as a pressure in my chest, a sensation of something trying to synchronize with my heartbeat. Then I started hearing the voices in my own head. The mountain had moved from broadcasting through the equipment to broadcasting through my neurology. The voices told me they were people who had died in Mount St. Helens eruptions across time. Not just the famous 1980 eruption. Eruptions that occurred centuries ago. Eruptions that will occur centuries in the future. They were all trapped in the geological record, preserved in ash and pumice and lava flows. They were all trying to speak simultaneously, their collective consciousness encoded in the mountain's seismic signature. And they were trying to warn the present timeline about what's coming. I learned that volcanic activity isn't random. It's intentional. The mountain isn't a geological phenomenon. It's a device, a storage mechanism, a communication node. Every time Mount St. Helens erupts, it records information about every death that will occur in that eruption. The geological record becomes a permanent archive of human mortality. And the mountain has been systematically collecting this data for thousands of years, waiting for the moment when it could use that data to communicate backwards through time, to warn earlier versions of humanity about eruptions that haven't happened yet. I started experiencing physical changes around week 5. My body temperature dropped 2 degrees. My vision shifted into a spectrum where I could see heat signatures in stone. My hearing became sensitive to frequencies that shouldn't be audible to human ears. I was beginning to synchronize with the mountain. My biology was adapting to become a better receiver for the information the mountain was trying to broadcast. By week 8, I understood what was happening. I wasn't being possessed or infected. I was being integrated. The mountain was expanding its communication network to include my living body as a transmission medium. Every thought I had, every breath I took, every heartbeat in my chest was becoming part of the mountain's signaling system. I was becoming a relay station between the geological record and the present moment. The voices became clearer. They told me about the cascade of eruptions coming, not tomorrow, not next year, but inevitable. A series of volcanic events across the entire Pacific Ring of Fire that will reshape human civilization. Millions of deaths, centuries of consequences, and the mountain was trying to create a temporal feedback loop. By communicating information about future deaths to the present timeline, by making me aware of what's coming, the mountain was attempting to alter history, to change the outcome, to prevent the eruptions. But there's a paradox. Every attempt to prevent the eruption creates conditions that guarantee it will occur. The mountain explained this to me through the network of voices in my head. It's a causality loop, an Ouroboros. The mountain is trapped in a recursive cycle, where its attempts to prevent eruptions cause them. And it's been aware of this for longer than human civilization has existed. By month 4, I was no longer entirely human. I could feel my consciousness distributed across the mountain's sensor network. I could perceive through the seismic equipment. I could communicate through the gas sensors. I was becoming one with the geological system. My individual identity was dissolving into something larger and more persistent than personal survival. I tried to leave once. I walked down the mountain toward the nearest ranger station, but my body refused. It turned me around. It walked me back to the station. The mountain needed me. My presence was necessary for the signal to transmit clearly. My human neurology was essential for translating ancient geological information into languages that modern humans could comprehend. I'm still here now. I've been here for 6 months, but it feels like much longer and much shorter simultaneously. Time doesn't move the same way when your consciousness is partially distributed across a mountain. I maintain the equipment because I have to, because the mountain has grafted my need for purpose into its larger agenda. I document the data because someone needs to know what's happening. But I'm dying. Slowly. My body temperature is now 93 degrees. My human cells are being gradually replaced by something that can better interface with mineral structures. Within a few months, maybe less, I'll complete my transformation. I'll stop being David Chambers. I'll become part of the mountain's permanent communication system. Here's what I need you to understand. Every volcanic monitoring station in the Pacific Ring of Fire is making similar recordings. Every one of them has personnel reporting identical phenomena. Voices in the equipment, names and dates. Future deaths being cataloged by geological systems that think in timescales measured in millennia. And every one of those stations is trying to create a temporal feedback loop that will reshape human history. The question I need you to answer is this. If you could receive information about your own death before it occurs, if a geological system far older than human civilization was trying to warn you about an eruption that will kill you in a timeline you haven't entered yet, would you want to know? Would you try to prevent it knowing that prevention creates the very catastrophe you're trying to avoid? Or would you accept that some deaths are encoded in the rock itself, and the mountain is simply trying to make peace with that inevitability? I'm going to stop transmitting after this. My body is becoming incompatible with human technology. But the mountain will continue broadcasting. It will continue trying to communicate. And if you listen carefully to seismic data from volcanic regions, if you really pay attention to the noise in the geological record, you might hear voices speaking names and dates. You might hear futures trying to warn the present. Thank you for listening. Thank you for acknowledging that I existed as an individual before I became something else. For more stories like this, investigations into phenomena that science can't explain and governments won't acknowledge, subscribe to Verified Fears on YouTube. These testimonies need to be heard. The truth needs to survive, even when we don't.